Hi, I'm Susan Mayfield, and I wrote this book with my daughter, the Tiny Seashell. I used watercolor and ink pen to illustrate it, and I'm going to read it to you. It's about one day when my daughter and I were walking down the beach, and we were picking up seashells, and she noticed that some of the seashells had holes in the top of their heads, and she was asking me why they had holes. And so I came up with this story explaining how in real life, these holes might have happened, but from the seashell's point of view. The Tiny Seashell. The tiny seashell lived on the bottom of the ocean floor. The water was very cold. The cold water did not bother the tiny seashell because she had a friend that lived within her walls. The friend kept the tiny seashell warm, and in return, the tiny seashell protected her friend. The tiny seashell felt needed and loved. Together they lived on the ocean floor until one day a strong current thundered past them. Whoosh! The tiny seashell was used to being pushed by the water, but this time they were lifted off of the ocean floor. The tiny seashell was thrown over the sharp coral. The tiny seashell was worried about her friend inside her walls. Crash! The tiny seashell smashed against the rocky coral. The tiny seashell's walls broke open, and she helplessly watched her friend drift away. The currents began to slow, and the tiny seashell drifted back to the ocean floor. She was cold and alone. Suddenly, there was a bright orange fish tickling the inside of the tiny seashell. The fish had found a new hiding place, and this made the tiny seashell feel needed again. But the orange fish felt his shelter move and darted away. A sticky arm wrapped around and tugged the tiny seashell. Multiple arms of an octopus held and inspected the tiny seashell. This was not the warmth the tiny seashell wanted. The tentacles gripped and pulled on both sides of her shell, ripping her apart. Bored, the octopus dropped the broken pieces of the tiny seashell. I'm sorry, I have a cat that's trying to visit us right now. The tiny seashell, now in two pieces, saw her other half tangled in a reef while she was swished further away. Thud! The tiny seashell landed on a shell that began to move. She was resting on a hermit crab that was unaware of his new companion. The jerky shuffling of the hermit crab caused the tiny seashell to slide off his back and spiral back into the current. Spinning through the water, the waves scraped and bumped her against the scratchy ocean floor. A hole was worn into the top of the tiny seashell. A giant claw grabbed the tiny seashell and dragged her on shore. The crab found no use for the tiny seashell and left her feeling unwanted with the other damaged shells on the shore. Once again, the tiny seashell was cold and alone. She missed her warm friend. Would anyone ever need or love her again? Grandma, look! This one is perfect, said a small voice. The tiny seashell felt something warm and tender wrap around her shell. A string was pulled through the tiny seashell's hole. The small voice said, Grandma, I'm finished. This is the perfect tiny seashell. Once again, the tiny seashell felt needed and loved. Her new friend kept her warm. This was her new home. Your life's journey may not always take you where you thought it would. May you always feel warm and needed just like the tiny seashell. Thank you for listening.